Hi, so I just want to give a presentation on a modern perspective on biosensors. So what we're going to discuss today is we are going to sort of touch on what a transducer is, and underneath transducers we'll then describe what a sensor is, and then I'm going to sort of slightly shift gear then and say, we know what a sensor is. So now let's talk about clinical laboratory testing and then contrast that with rapid diagnostic testing. And we'll see that rapid diagnostic testing is, in my opinion, another way of saying point of care testing. And then I just want to touch on the future of sensors, and I am going to touch on the Internet of Things, and not so much there on wearable biosensors, but wearable biosensors definitely is one of the futures of sensors and biosensors. So first of all, um, what is a sort of transducer? What is a sensor? So I have this at the beginning, at the top of this slide. I have sensor, and it grays through to transducer. And the reason I'm doing that is because I really feel that these two words are sort of synonymous with each other. Now, strictly speaking, a transducer is any device that converts energy from one form to another. And underneath that definition, then you have a sensor that sort of receives a or measures a physical change in the system and gives you a signal as a response to it. Now, physical change is kind of like could be thought of as energy, and we get a signal, which is then also energy. So a sensor really is a form of transducer. Whereas maybe transducer is more generic, it transforms energy from one form to another. A sensor is more, it's not so much interested in conversion of energy, it's sensing the physical system, and we get a signal from that response to something that changes in the physical system. So transducer is the overall term, and underneath there then there's sensor. Now underneath sensor you then have active and passive sensors. Now this whole series, and whenever you hear me speak, I will always be talking about electrochemical sensors. So underneath this definition of sensor, we have active and passive. So an active sensor in my world is, for example, an amperometric sensor, and the classic biosensor is an amperometric glucose sensor. So glucose sensors that are used for measuring the blood in diabetics are often amperometric. Now you have another type of sensor which is passive. The pH sensor in a laboratory for measuring the pH of solutions is a classic passive sensor. It's a potentiometric sensor. The other type of passive sensor are fuel cells. So in this office, I actually have a carbon monoxide sensor. That's actually a fuel cell. In later lectures, I am going to talk about biofuel cells, but I want another type of passive electrochemical sensor. I mentioned the pH sensor, which is a form of potentiometric sensor, which is also a form of, another word for it is ion selective electrode. So a sodium ion selective electrode, for example, is a passive type of sensor. They generate their own voltage and you measure that voltage. They don't need energy in order to work. So passive, they don't by default require energy to work, and active, they do require a source of energy in order to work. So we have transducers and sensors, and then under sensors we have active and passive. So here's some sort of classic examples of transducers. So we have the microphone, which effectively receives pressure waves. My voice is generating a pressure wave. The microphone responds to it. We get a small electrical signal that's amplified, and then it's outputted by the speaker. So that's a sort of transducer. You could so easily say, a microphone is almost like a sensor. It senses the pressure wave and converts it to energy. So that's why I find it so difficult, to sort of it's so easy to use both words. You could call it a transducer, you could call it a sensor, but they do say, a microphone linked to a speaker is really a transducer. Now, another classic here, that you have a temperature sensor which gives a analog output, and they say there's a transducer between those two things. You could say it was a sensor, but I have spent, quite a while trying to really find a very black and white definition of transducer and sensor. But depending on the field, some people are sort of using the word transducer and some people are using the word sensor. But a transducer is not necessarily a sensor. It's a way of converting energy from one form to another. So I suppose, a transducer, for example, if you've got a water wheel, it's converting the energy of the water and converting it, for example, into rotational energy for grinding wheat up, for example. So that is a sort of transducer. Now, the last transducer I have on this slide is really a mechanical transducer. So there are lots of things like weight or load or pressure or strain. You are deforming effectively a material and its resistance is changing. And you measure that change in resistance by a very important circuit called the Wheatstone bridge. I'm not going to explain the Wheatstone bridge today in this lecture because I'm particularly interested in electrochemical sensing. So I'm not so interested today in talking about these kind of physical sensors, but the Wheatstone bridge is used an awful lot in engineering and electronics, and you should be aware of it. And I would even encourage you to go away and look it up, just for your interest, really, because it's so ubiquitous, let's say, in engineering and science, that you should at least be aware of the Wheatstone bridge. So, I'm very interested in sensors, and in this life there are mechanical sensors and thermal sensors and electric sensors and magnetic and radiation. And when I say radiation, you've got electromagnetic radiation, so the light that's falling on me now is a form of electromagnetic radiation. I mean, you also have another form of radiation which is corpuscle radiation, which is neutrons, protons, electrons, alpha particles. These are kind of more particulate type radiation. And I'm particularly interested in chemical radiation. So, the kind of sensing I'm interested in is turning those chemical parameters into electrical signals. And that's what electrochemistry and electrochemical sensing is all about. Measuring chemical and biological phenomena and trying to convert them into electrical signal. And that's almost like I really like electrochemistry for that. It's a very pure science. We live in a chemical and biological world, and it's a very good science or technique for converting it into electrical signals, because we then live in a very electronics world, with computers, big data, the internet. We need to convert these things into bits and bytes, and electrochemistry is really good at that. Now, we are interested in biosensors. So, and biosensors that we're interested in are often used in diagnostics. But let's put the context of where the biosensor comes in. So you have an analyte, and it could be COVID-19, for example. And that COVID-19 needs to be brought to the sensor. And here I have sort of three words. We have a sensor which can do detection, and often sensors, when being used for medical applications, are sometimes called IVD, in vitro diagnostics. So the IVD then gives you a test result, and it says, positive and negative, and if it's positive, it might tell you to what degree are you positive. So you have COVID-19, it's brought to the sensor, it's detected, there's a test result that says, yeah, positive, and that's a diagnostic test result. Now, really, the diagnosis is actually always made by a doctor or a health practitioner, and they'll look at the test result, and they'll look at signs and symptoms of the patients, because the test result, without the context of how the patient looks or feels, it could be, the test result might be, it could be erroneous, or you can get a positive test result, but actually, that doesn't necessarily define the actual disease. It doesn't always just, it's not just clear from the test result alone what disease somebody has. So a health practitioner, a health professional has to look at the test result, the signs and symptoms. So as much as I love electrochemical biosensing, it has to be used by medical professionals in the context of the patient as well. So I've just here want to kind of give a sort of, the kind of things that we do at Zimmer and Peacock is we like to make we call them, point of care devices. And a point of care device here is this classic glucose sensor where the diabetic is testing their blood for the glucose in the blood, and they're doing it. There's a glucose strip and a glucose meter. Just out of interest, they call this the razor blade kind of model, where you may actually give the meter away at quite a low cost because you're really trying to make your money on the strips. But another type of rapid diagnostic testing or point of care testing is the lateral flow strip. So lateral flows is used in pregnancy testing. I think that's one of the biggest applications for it. And also there's a lot of antibody testing going around at the moment for COVID-19, and they're using lateral flow strips. So you have a range of instruments in diagnostic testing. You have these clinical analyzers on one end of the sort of size scale, going to these very small rapid tests or point of care tests. And it's worth looking at the clinical analyzer. There's a guy stood there. That clinical analyzer is about 2.5 meters long. It's a good 0.5 meter deep. It's about 1.5 meters high. So, clinical analyzers are in central laboratories. And in my own professional career, I'm very interested in, taking clinical tests and putting them into the hands of the patients or bringing them out of the centralized hospitals. In the US and the UK, for example, and Europe, people have their blood taken at the doctors. The blood is sent to the central laboratory, and then the results come back, several days later. And it's in which time somebody's already been given, let's say, a course of antibiotics, which actually they may not have needed to receive because they may have actually had a virus, and therefore the antibiotics are not even going to work. So the centralized testing has its limitations. It's been around for easily over 40 years. And is there a more modern way of doing the testing on patients? Yeah, and there is. There's rapid testing near the point of care. So one of the sort of trends in biosensing is kind of miniaturization. So historically, you've had these clinical lab analyzers. They're big. They can take they can take a vial of blood and do lots of tests on it. Those have been shrinking down. So you have this Piccolo by a company called Abaxis, and there's a rotor here. It's a circular disc. You put the blood in the center of it. It rotates it. It distributes the blood to lots of wells on the circumference, and it can do lots of tests on it. So it's basically a shrinkage of the clinical lab analyzer down to a desktop instrument. So that's a scale down. And then you've got the iStat here, which is the grandfather of point of care testing, where you can see it's really hand sized, and you have cartridges for sort of potassium and lactate and glucose. So there's different cartridges, but you can only do one test at a time. So the clinical analyzer can take lots of patient sample and do lots of tests on them. So it's high throughput. Then you have the benchtop system where it's one patient sample, but it can do lots of tests on that one patient sample. Then you have the handheld analyzer, which can take one patient sample and do one test on it at a time. And then you have really less than a hand size, this palm size device, which is a typical glucose sensor. So it's not like we're trying to do everything that the clinical analyzer can do in our palm size device. We've reduced it down to just one test on one sample, but very quickly and where the patient actually needs it. So if you've got lots of patients and you want to know lots of things about all of those patients' blood, then you do need to be in these centralized laboratories where they can do that kind of work. In some parts of the world, actually, you want to know lots of things about the patient's sample, but you can't afford a clinical analyzer, or you don't have that many patients, in which point you can use one of these tabletop devices. And then if you really want the patient to take care of themselves at home, for example, then these palm-sized devices. But the trend has basically been miniaturization over the decades. And then the trend is more than miniaturization. It's now becoming wearable. So I have my Apple Watch on. Just this week, this has taken a further step closer to being a biosensor, because I think they're now putting oximetry on the next generation of that. Now, oximetry is basically shining light and looking at the light that comes back and measuring the percentage of hemoglobin, so it's non-invasive. But that's becoming a form of biosensor. So I said on the slide just before, everything is miniaturizing, and now down to palm size, and now it's going from palm size to actually wearable. So we're doing wearable tech for biosensing, on skin biosensing. So people are very interested in sweat analysis. I think we're getting very close to actually putting the sensors directly on the skin. So not necessarily measuring the sweat, but actually measuring on the skin. And then clothing, I think, is really going to become a biosensing platform. So your clothing will become like a second smart skin for you. So the future of sensing for me is miniaturization, is already kind of coming and already here. And if we are going to go wearable, then these sensors are going to have to become low power, which really goes back to one of my slides at the very beginning of this. I said that there were maybe two types of sensors, passive and active, and passive required, let's say, no power, and those were potentiometric sensors and biofuel cell sensors. So when you're thinking about wearable sensors, you do have to think about the power a bit more than if you were making a handheld device. So the trend is towards miniaturization on biosensing and low power on biosensing. And I put in here parallelization of biosensing. And that really means, well, the Internet of Things. It's a subset of the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things means putting sensors or connecting objects to the Internet. So I'm very interested then in obviously putting biosensors into objects and sensing and transmitting that data off to the internet. And I really think that in biosensing, where we're going is, rather than measuring a subject or measuring something with just one sensor, let's measure them with 20 low-cost sensors, because I would rather be using the data from 20 low-cost sensors than the data from one high-cost sensor, because I can fool one high-cost sensor, but I'm hoping that on average, even if I fool one of the 20 low-cost biosensors, the other 19 are still giving me, let's say, a more accurate result. So the future of sensing is miniaturization. That's already happening. Low power, that's already happening. And I will also say that the Internet of Things, or having a lot of sensors in the environment, all giving me data, and they're all cooperating one another, so that actually I can believe the story, is also one of the futures of sensing. So obviously I've already touched upon the Internet of Things, which is, giving objects connectivity. And I think that, it's not only giving objects connectivity, but it's also letting objects measure something and then using their connectivity. For example, we've got a product called the Food Sense, and the Food Sense connects to the iPhone, and therefore we can get the data. We can measure the hotness of chili on our Food Sense. The data goes onto the iPhone, and the iPhone can send the data off to the cloud. So when I look at the Internet of Things, there's a lot of sensing involved in this. I've got a humidity and temperature sensor. Let me just grab that, for example. So this is a humidity and temperature sensor. Very relevant at the moment. You've got a lot of people talking about, the sensor itself is a little dot here. You've got a lot of people talking about, unfortunately, COVID-19 and the air quality and how many people are in a room. And if you want to know how many people are in a room, one way of doing it is actually measuring the humidity in the air. People, when they breathe out, they deliver a lot of humidity. So if you want to know about the air quality in a room, temperature and humidity is not a bad thing to be measuring. It's quite easily done. So in the Internet of Things, you can measure temperature, humidity quite readily. You can measure acoustics quite readily. You can measure flow quite readily. You can measure load quite readily. Electromagnetic radiation, movement, vibration, these things are quite easy to measure. But the beautiful thing is there's something missing in all this Internet of Things. It's the chemical and biological sensors for me that are really missing. Gas sensing there's a good industry around gas sensing. I mean, like I mentioned, I have a carbon monoxide sensor in this room. So people are measuring carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and oxygen in the atmosphere and nitric oxides and particulates quite often. but what they're not measuring are, things like glucose and lactate and sodium and potassium and all the COVID-19, all the interesting analytes. These are missing. And so, if you're interested in becoming involved in the Internet of Things and sensing, then I would really suggest chemical and biological is the way to go. So I'm just going to do a quick summary now. So a transducer is a device that can convert energy from one form to another. A sensor really is a form of transducer, except I suppose its emphasis is on measuring a physical change and giving out a signal due to that physical change. Now, in biosensing, we have a range of instruments. We have the clinical laboratory analyzer, which is the large behemoth, which can receive lots of samples from lots of patients, make lots of measurements upon each one of those samples. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, which is these rapid diagnostic tests, where it might be a palm-sized instrument, which I take my drop of blood, I put it on the sensor, I get an immediate answer. So it's one patient with one sample making one measurement, quite restricted. And that's really also point of care. So, and what I mean by that is if I'm a diabetic and I want to give myself an insulin injection, then I'm going to have to know I'm going to have to take care of myself. And in order to do that care, I'm going to have to know my glucose level. And so a glucose sensor is a point of care device. Now, the future of sensors, I think one of the big futures of sensors is wearable. And really connected to that is Internet of Things. And on the Internet of Things, biosensors are miniaturizing. They need to become low power. And I think there's going to be a lot more sensors, or a lot more biological sensors in the environment, or on us as people, or in our rooms, all sending data and basically, if I have 20 sensors, I'm expecting them, and they're in a similar environment, then I'm expecting 20 signals telling me a similar thing. And that's really good because it gives me redundancy. Because if one of them breaks down or goes wrong, I can sort of see that one sensor is out of family with the other 19 sensors, and as a system, it will carry on working. Okay, so that's our introduction, or our discussion today, our modern perspective on biosensors. Okay, thanks very much. Appreciate it.